all here in person. My name is Dan Tokaji. I am the dean of this great law school. And isn't it fantastic after 2.5 plus counting years of this pandemic to be together back in person for this wonderful lecture? I tell you, it is such a thrill for me. This is one of our marquee lectures, one of our marquee events of each year, the Kastenmeier Lecture. And it's the first time in my more than 2 years as dean that I've had the privilege of introducing it and introducing our distinguished speaker in person. So it is wonderful to be here actually physically together and to see all of your faces. I really cannot tell you how happy it makes me feel. Let me say just a couple of words about the Kastenmeier Lecture before introducing our Kastenmeier lecturer for this year. The Kastenmeier Lecture is, of course, named after the legendary Robert W. Kastenmeier, a 1952 graduate of the University of Wisconsin Law School who was born and grew up in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, which I had the privilege of visiting just a couple of weeks ago. He served in the United States Congress with great distinction for over 3 decades, from 1958 to 1990. And over the course of his long career, made many contributions to the law, including to the improvements of the judiciary and intellectual property law. This lecture series was created as a way of remembering him by those who served with him, those whom he mentored, and his many, many friends, to recognize in particular his contributions to the fields in which he was most deeply involved, including intellectual property, corrections, administration of justice, and civil liberties. And, given Robert Kastenmeier's lifetime of public service, it is a special privilege this evening to introduce someone who likewise has devoted so much of his life and his career to public service. Our Kastenmeier lecturer this year, Larry Krasner, was sworn in for a second term as Philadelphia's 26th district attorney on January 2nd, 2022. He was born in 1961 in St. Louis, Missouri. He attended public school in both St. Louis and later Philadelphia, earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago in 1983, and his law degree from Stanford in 1987. Early in his career, Mr. Krasner served as a federal public defender before entering private practice in civil rights and criminal defense. And before being elected Philadelphia's district attorney, he served as co-counsel for the law firm of Greenblatt, Pierce, Funton, Flores. He has lived in Philadelphia for more than 3 decades with his wife of over 30 years, retired Court of Common Pleas Judge Lisa M. Rao, and they have 2 adult sons. He has gained a national and indeed even international reputation for being a trailblazing prosecutor. Among the current generation of what are sometimes referred to as progressive prosecutors who are going places where prosecutors have not historically gone, and showing that a commitment to criminal justice and civil rights are not, in fact, incompatible, but at their best go together. So please, please join me in welcoming our Kastenmeier lecturer for 2022, Larry Krasner.
Everybody stay calm. Nobody get upset. It's going to be okay. I have some thank yous, but before I give those thank yous, I want to ask you a question. Would you like to live in a country that had 1/9 the number of homicides or the level of homicides and 1/9 the level of incarceration? Would you like to live in that country? Because that country is modern Germany. Would you like to live in a country where the total number of gun fatalities in a year, a country with half our population, will be 1, and the total number of shootings will be 12? Would you like to live in that country? Would you like to live in a country that has had more success with rehabilitating people from profound opioid addiction than any other country in the world, and has done it without using arrests, judges, lawyers, jails, based on plans that came from a doctor? The first country is Germany. The second country is Japan. The third country is Portugal. That's what's going on right now in some other places. So my question to you is, even if we aren't that, and we aren't those countries, even if we can't quite be that, can we get closer to that? And I'd like to talk to you about how. So I do have some thank yous, though. I want to thank Professor Keith A. Findley of Wisconsin Law School. I want to thank the Dean for introducing me. Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank John Holloway, who apparently got together with Professor Lindley. John Holloway is the executive director at the Quattrone Center in Philadelphia and associate dean at Penn Law, for connecting Wisconsin and this wonderful lecture to my opportunity to speak. I want to thank Professors Lanny Glinberg, Stephanie Holmes-Didwania for hosting my wife, Lisa Rao, who is here, surrounded by so many other judges, for hosting us for a great lunch where we had a wonderful discussion, and we also had some really wonderful cheese curds. I also want to thank Professor Anush Desai and the committee for selecting me. Finally, I want to thank this amazing law school, which is well known for its distinguished history of producing some of the best prosecutors in the country. Prosecutors who include Wisconsin alumni Rebecca Steck, Chris Rudolph, and Adam Maltz, who are at this moment assistant DAs in my office in Philadelphia. And I also want to thank great public officials like Congressman Robert W. Kastenmeier, whose legacy of public service and integrity are rightly celebrated here every year. So when I was preparing to speak to you today, I did watch a number of Kastenmeier lectures to figure out what I was up against from the Wisconsin archives. And they were all thoughtful and they were all interesting, but I was especially drawn to one. I'll bet you know which one. And that was the interview of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor in 2016. I see some nods. I think that means some of you were there, that giant room when she was walking up and down the aisles, shaking one hand after another, speaking like a Supreme Court justice in a measured, even tone. And she said something that struck me. I got to admit, I'm a huge fan of Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She is on my list of sheroes. In fact, when I got to the DA's office, we had the largest room. Our training room was named for another person. And I fairly quickly changed the name, Justice Sonia Sotomayor Training Center. That is where we train all of our young attorneys. At any rate, in 2016, she was charming, she was candid, she was talking about her life and many other things. And she was talking about what it meant to be a state prosecutor, a state prosecutor. I started my career as a state public defender for 3 years, and then I became a federal public defender for 2 before I launched my practice. And there is a difference, and she talked about the difference, which is being drastically under-resourced. For those of you who know, probably about 95% of all criminal cases are handled in the state system. Huge caseloads. For example, right now, I can tell you in Philadelphia, we have almost 650 open homicide cases. And if you go down to the street to my wonderful friends at the federal prosecutor's office, they might have 5. The reality is it's a different thing to be a Supreme Court justice who has been a state prosecutor than it is to be one who has been a better resourced federal prosecutor. Their work is incredibly important, make no mistake, but it's a different experience. And this is what she said in that lecture. She said, quote, "When I left being a prosecutor in New York, I didn't want to practice criminal law anymore," unquote. And then she said why. She said that she had found herself charging the same man with the same crime 2 times in a 3-year span. Quote, "And I thought to myself, I'm on the wrong end of this. By the time defendants get to the criminal justice system, it's much harder to turn their lives around." She continued, quote, "It's much easier, a better investment, both of my time and our resources as a nation, to invest in kids when they're young, to keep them away from the temptations of the streets, than to undo the bad that the streets create," unquote. She said she was quitting criminal prosecution. She didn't want to do it again. She wanted to become a corporate attorney because she felt she was on the wrong end of this. And she specifically referred to how we should invest our resources. It is my hope in this little chat to be able to continue that conversation that she started in 2016, because I think she said a couple things there that are really very, very important. So let me tell you a little bit about my story, and maybe that will give you a sense of how I got to think what I think, because the reality is when I came out of law school, I didn't think the things that I think now. When I got out of law school, it was 1987. I was under the impression if you worked really hard as a public defender or as a prosecutor, and if you tried to be fair, that the system was going to work pretty well. It was going to work just fine, that there was nothing fundamentally broken about the system. The only problem with that was the 35 years that followed. It was the 30 years before I came to the, frankly, very unlikely conclusion that I needed to run for district attorney, something I never really wanted to do. And it was the experiences that I had primarily in those years that brought me to those conclusions, but it did start a little bit earlier. So I should probably tell you about that as well. I consider it a valuable aspect of any job interview with anyone to become an attorney in the office to see if they've ever been an outsider. Have they ever not been privileged? Do they know what it's like to be the kid who gets beaten up? There's a reason for that. There are things you learn through that. There is a tremendous advantage in that, because the criminal justice system in the United States doesn't spend a whole lot of time going after insider trading. It doesn't spend a whole lot of time effectively going after presidents. It actually just really, really good at going after poor people and Black people and brown people and gay people and people who are not rich and do not have power. There's nothing new about government kneeling and bending to power and to money, but the criminal justice system is especially inclined that way. And so when I interview people, I just want to know whether they've witnessed that. They don't have to have experienced it themselves, but have they seen that? Well, without getting into all the details, I had the opportunity to witness that when I was young, and it helped. And then when I came out of law school, I took a year off. I was a carpenter. Strangely enough, I got picked for a jury, and not just any jury. I got picked for a death penalty jury at 23 years of age in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is right outside of Philadelphia, For those of you who are students of the death penalty, you will be aware that for a while, the Supreme Court said, no, we can't. And it said, yes, we can. Well, right when they said, yes, we can, Chester County decided that they were going to pursue the death penalty in the case where I was selected. This was the murder and rape of an elderly woman. The house was burned down on top of her, and her son happened to be an FBI agent. And as a consequence of her son being an FBI agents came from everywhere. The case was solved very quickly, and the evidence was overwhelming. The evidence consisted, among other things, of the fact that the defendant was known to have done work on the property for the victim. The defendant was located in a nearby motel. Her car was parked in the motel. There was a thumbprint, which was on the rear view mirror, and I think a side mirror as well. It's been a couple of years. And the thumbprint was in her blood. This was really not much of a whodunit. This was, however, a serious matter to anybody who takes these things seriously. And so I was selected, a person who didn't have profound, strong, deeply held beliefs about the death penalty and didn't know that much about it. I'm 23 years of age. And what I experienced on that jury was formative and got me to where I am. At least it got me to applying to be a prosecutor or a defense attorney in 1987, before 30 plus years of learning what I've learned, right? To make a very long story much, much shorter, we heard the evidence. We went back to deliberate, and one of the other jurors stood up. He pulled a tiny Bible out of his back pocket, which he opened. He was holding it upside down, and he started mumbling things about who was he to judge another person. So we started to ask him what was going on, because the mumbling seemed a bit incoherent, the Bible upside down. Soon enough, the whole system collectively figured out that what had gone on is, with all the publicity surrounding this important trial as a sequestered jury, this juror had lied during jury selection, said he had no mental health issues, that he was not taking mental health medication, in other words, psychotropic drugs. And as a consequence, as he lived in a hotel, the same hotel where I was living with the rest of the jurors, he began to decompensate. And by the time we were deliberating, with the alternates already excused, judges, just for your benefit, by the time that happened, he was no longer capable of sitting in judgment for more than one reason. And so he was removed. We were jurors. We didn't understand the significance. In Pennsylvania, you needed to have a verdict of 12 or an agreement to accept fewer than 12. But the judge said for us to continue, all 11 of us, and we did for a couple of days, taking the job very seriously. We came in and returned a verdict of guilty in the first degree on murder, plus guilty on other charges, fully expecting to go back out and do the separate death phase, because that is how it worked. And then we were sent home. And the reason we were sent home is that the defense attorney did about the only good thing he did in that trial. He didn't have much to work with, but he cut a deal that a verdict of 11 would be enough, so long as there was no death penalty, and the prosecutor accepted that deal. That experience, as I said, was formative, certainly got me here in a sense, but it also taught me something pretty important, which is the system ain't perfect. It's not perfect at picking jurors. The jurors ain't perfect. And sometimes the results that can come out of that aren't perfect either. And especially if we're talking about whether a person gets to live or die, we need to think twice, and we need to think carefully about what we are doing. Nevertheless, I was driven at that point to become a part of that system and to be either a prosecutor or a defense attorney. And so I went to law school with that in mind. I interviewed for these positions. I was offered prosecutorial positions around the country, public defender positions around the country, and I ended up in Philadelphia, having interviewed at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, where I got into a fight during the interview about the death penalty. Believe it or not, they did not offer me a position. But I did get accepted by the Public Defender's Office, which at the time had won an award as arguably the best office in the country, and started my career there. And then came 30 years of what I can only fairly characterize as diligent effort, where I got quite a bit of justice for individuals, but the entire system got worse the entire time, in my opinion. And it's felt to me as if I was watching a slow motion car crash over those 30 years. For those of you who have studied this, and I'm sure many of you had, the period from 1987 up until when I was running, which was 2017, overlapped mightily with the rise of mass incarceration in the United States and got to where we are now. And that is that the land of freedom isn't. We are, in fact, the most incarcerated country in the world. We are more incarcerated than Russia, Putin's Russia. And we are also the most heavily armed population, at least among any industrialized nation in the world. For those of you who have been in the system, you will know what I'm about to tell you is also true. And this comes from my police officer friends, of whom I have seen, including a couple of them protecting me from all of you here today. There are not only far more guns on the street now than when I started my career as a public defender, but when police bust a corner in Philly for drugs, they used to find one guy with a gun. Now everybody has a gun. The price of that gun on the street in the illegal market is far below, much cheaper than what it was 30 years ago. Likewise, if you look at the illegal drug markets, there are more drugs available, they are more potent, and they are cheaper than they were 30 years ago. The number of fatal overdoses from opioids in the city of Philadelphia this year will be more than one every time you have a meal. Fatal overdoses. 80+% opioid related, and fentanyl, which has somehow made heroin seem safer. Fentanyl has not just infiltrated all opioids, it has infiltrated all kinds of other drugs. Pills that appear to be pharmaceutical, crack, cocaine. 25-year addicts to crack are dying in the street because they took the same dose they've taken for 25 and it's laced with fentanyl. That is where we have gotten with our approach to public safety. And then you could look at some of the other places I mentioned and wonder, can we do better? Is there something that we can do better? Well, I'm going to suggest that there is, and then I'm going to stop talking in about 15, 18 minutes. And then I really look forward to your questions, not only here, but for those of you who hang around, I look forward to your questions during that period of time. I suggest to you we can do better. There are many, many different things that I think fairly characterize what we call reform prosecution or what we call progressive prosecution. I'm sure you're aware of some of them. But there's also a lot of spin that I think, frankly, is disinformation, and it should be corrected. So at least in my mind, we are speaking with progressive prosecution or reform prosecution of a very, very important social justice movement that is the direct result of mass incarceration. And it is the direct result of certain kinds of policing that have done more harm than good in terms of keeping us safe. And if you think about this for a minute, 20 years ago, there were essentially no progressive prosecutors and no reform prosecutors. I can tell you that that has changed, and it is not because of me. I'm not the first one to do this. There have been a number of examples over the years, people who've done things of significance. But if we look at what I would identify as sort of the real moment when this began, which is probably around 2011, most likely the same year as Michelle Alexander published the book, The New Jim Crow, what you will see is that there were gains until 10% of the United States population lived in a jurisdiction that had a progressive prosecutor, and that was 2.5 years ago. 10%, 35 million Americans lived in those jurisdictions. Many of them were larger and had large numbers of cases. So the influence at that time was maybe 15% of all criminal matters, something like that. Well, during the period of the murder of George Floyd and the unrest that surrounded it, that increased to about 20%. We got to 70 to 75 million Americans electing and re-electing progressive or reform prosecutors, and the influence once again of 20% of the population, because these were areas, often urban areas, large urban areas, you were talking maybe 30% of all the criminal cases in the United States were in those jurisdictions. That's where we stand now. I know that there have been some setbacks, but there have been some gains. For example, they talk a lot about Chesa Boudin being recalled in San Francisco, which of course he was successfully, but they don't talk about the fact that Pamela Price, who is the candidate in Alameda County, otherwise known as Oakland, otherwise known as the other side of the water, right there, who lost 4 years ago, is about to win right now. And that's a bigger jurisdiction than San Francisco. So I think the fairest view of that is that right now, in a moment of tremendous crisis, having to do with gun violence and having to do with crime generally, progressive prosecution is not only not ending, it's not even being pushed back significantly. It's simply not doubling again right now. That's where we are. So why is this all happening? Well, I believe it's happening because reform prosecutors and progressive prosecutors are addressing a very, very long-standing problem that is deep and profound and important. I believe it's happening because the crushing weight of mass incarceration doesn't just affect those people in jail, some of whom need to be there. I'll say it again, some of whom need to be there, and others of whom do not. It does not just affect them and their family. The crushing weight of mass incarceration is now something that is well known for having happened to anybody's high school friend, anybody's coworker, anybody's third cousin. It has affected in one way or another, or come to the attention of almost all of us. And it has affected how we think about this. In the same way, there is a shifting of attitude around opioid addiction, an addiction that affects to a much larger extent white people than prior addictions to other drugs. In the same way, there has been an admittedly both shameful and positive adjustment in attitudes about addiction. Those decades of accumulated incarceration have gotten us to a point of seriously reconsidering what we are doing and how we are doing it. So what then does progressive prosecution offer? I think what it offers first and foremost is a willingness to try to do things in a new way, try to do enforcement in a new way. Every progressive prosecutor I know, and I know about 60 around the country, will tell you that they believe that one of the biggest harms of mass incarceration is that we spend a lot of time putting people who are addicted in jail, putting people with mental illness in jail while we dismantled a mental health system. And all of those resources were not used on homicide cases. The average police budget in the United States only includes about 4 or 5% of that budget spent on homicide cases. The rest of the money is going for things like what? Making sure a retail theft is a felony, things like turnstile jumping, quote, quality of life, unquote, crimes. Thank you, Rudy Giuliani, for that concept. I am sorry you were disbarred. What sense does that make? I mean, part of what we're after is to refocus enforcement on the individuals who are ripping apart society with truly profoundly violent, awful crimes. Why aren't we doing that? Philadelphia is actually a very good example. We have learned certain things in Philadelphia because of the rigorous our conviction integrity work. We now have 26 exonerations. People who were doing life sentences or very long sentences, nearly all of whom were completely innocent, a few of whom live in a murk as a result of improper tactics by prosecutors and by police that will never be cleared away. But those are convictions that lack integrity. What we have learned is that for decades in Philadelphia, they did not have the resources they needed to do forensics the right way. And we know this because we see other cities where the DNA samples were taken and they're still there. The fingerprints were taken and they're still there. And we look at Philly and what we see is a young guy who got sweated in a box and said, Joe did it. And that was enough for decades in Philadelphia. Well, we The progressive prosecutors are the ones hollering and screaming and saying, come on, give me some forensics. A, we can solve way more crimes. B, we'll actually get the people who did it. C, we can win them in a courtroom. That's us. That is not actually the police union in Philadelphia, which after 4 years of by loudly advocating it, yet has to say once that they support that. Their job is about compensation. Their job is about, frankly, the avoidance of accountability in many ways, disciplinary and otherwise. That's a longer talk for the Q&A. I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. But that's what we're saying. We're saying, can we get modern? Can we do stuff that's new? Can we do stuff that works? The solve rate in Philadelphia, as I talk to you now, the last full year we can measure, solve rate for shootings, and this is, again, this is not to throw blame on the have this tool in their toolbox. They need this tool. I want them to have this tool. I want them to have the money to have the tool. But their solve rate for shootings is 17%. Their solve rate for fatal is 28%. 72 out of 100 people who kill somebody with a gun get away with it? Does that sound like a perfect system to you? Or does it sound to you like maybe we should do something other than spend 4 or 5% of our police budget on homicides while we're worrying about a whole lot of Rudy Giuliani's list? I think we need to go a different direction. I can tell you as I sit here now, there are types of forensics that will absolutely blow your mind. I'll tell you one. Please do not tell any criminals. So increasingly with shootings, there are a large number of fired cartridge casings left in the area, left at the crime scene. Philadelphia collects 50 to 60,000 fired cartridge casings. This is the brass end of a bullet, for those of you not entirely familiar with firearms, that is ejected from a semi-automatic weapon, and most weapons are semi-automatic, and is left there. We see crime scenes all the time with 60, 50. Might be 3 guns, often is 3 guns that are used. Did you know you can get DNA from them? This did not used to be the case, but we are at the point where if you pick up 50 of them, you're going to get DNA, despite the heat, despite the explosion, despite all that, you're going to get DNA off of 20 to 25% of those fired cartridge cases. Out of 50, you're going to have 10 to 12 or 13 with DNA on them. And what we don't have witnesses. And there are good reasons, sadly, why we don't have witnesses. We do case after case, we investigate case after case, where every neighbor says, I didn't see anything. The victim, if the victim is living, often says, I ain't talking to you because of other things that are going on. And we have to try to put together, this is why they cannot solve these cases. Imagine a world out of our 60,000 or so fired cartridge casings a year, we could get 12,000 clues that we don't have. Some of that DNA will connect directly to DNA that's already in a database, and we know tomorrow who loaded that gun. And where we don't know tomorrow, because the DNA is not in a database, we will be able to connect that shooting to that shooting to that shooting. Guns are handed around anymore, but DNA is not. So we will be able to do that. Why isn't that done? Why haven't we been doing that? Doesn't that make a lot of sense? To me, it most certainly does. Social media offers tremendous forensic opportunities as well. Cell phones offer increasing and amazing opportunities for geolocation, to see that the phone went right to where the shots were fired and ran the other way. This is amazing stuff. It's what we should be doing, but it's not what we have been doing historically or traditionally. That is a part, a fundamental part of modern prosecution, progressive prosecution, and it flows from our desire to focus on the most serious crimes, the ones that tear apart society, and stop focusing on a person who has mental illness and some food for the 3rd time. And then, of course, there's the other side. And this is what Justice Sotomayor was talking about. The other side is invest in prevention. That's what she was saying. So anyone who has been in a homicide room, tried a homicide case, I know many of you have. I have directly or indirectly been in every seat in that room, except judge or witness. But anyone who has done that knows that there is no happy ending in that room. You have a lost loved one. And then if the prosecution is successful, you have another person who's going away for life, or maybe getting death, or at least going away for a very, very long period of time. And that is a sliver of justice. There is some accountability. It's a sliver of justice. But if you talk to those survivors, as I do and have done for most of my career, they will tell you what you already know, which is what they really want is their loved one back and the bullet back in the gun and no blood on the ground. That's what they really want. They want prevention. They want to prevent it in the first place. That's what they want. That is what justice looks like, not what we do after the bullets left the gun. So how do we get there? What do we need to do? Well, I mean, I think we all know there's public education. I'm a product of public education. Wouldn't it be nice if we funded public education? Come to Philadelphia. It's surrounded by a whole bunch of collar counties where every kid, and I was one of those kids, counties has twice as many dollars spent on their education as a kid in Philly. And our public educational system is failing because our state does not want to fund it and chooses not to fund it. That's one thing you do. You rebuild the mental health system that is gone. You make healthcare available in sweeping ways, like they did in Portugal, when Portugal managed to reduce the level of entrenched heroin use in Lisbon by 80% over 20 years, simply by providing voluntary services to people who were not arrested. That's what they did in Portugal. I could go on, but you already know. And I'll tell you exactly how you know, because sadly, the pandemic has taught us the value of prevention in a remarkable way. I'm 61. I think like everybody in this room, I can safely say that we have never seen a period of time when all organized sports shut down in and out of school, as the pandemic did. We've never seen a period of time when classrooms were closed continuously, or in many instances 2 years, but at least 1 year. We've never seen a period of time when houses of faith shut down their programming. We have never seen this, frankly, inadequately supported, inadequately funded level of prevention disappear. And what happened when it did disappear during the pandemic is you saw this bizarre, astronomical increase in gun violence that was not initially followed by an increase in other types of crime. Right now that's shifting, but that's what you saw. And yet we find ourselves in this position where it is the progressive prosecutors, the reform prosecutors, that are saying, we now know the value of prevention. We now know that we have to double and triple down on prevention. And the answer coming from the other side is you did it. You did this, progressive prosecutors. Pandemic has nothing to do with it. You did this. This is all you. Well, I beg to differ. And I'm not the only one who begs to differ. Every criminologist studied this. Everyone who has looked at this has found the following. And I would refer you, for example, to the writings of John Fath, professor at a less distinguished law school, the Fordham Law School, and an economist, but don't hold that against him, who has looked very specifically and found that there's absolutely no correlation between whether or not you have a progressive prosecutor as opposed to a more traditional prosecutor in that location. He is not the only one. We can certainly give you the footnotes later if you'd like to see it. Is anybody talking about the fact that according to an article called The Red State Murder Problem, that 8 out of 10 of the most murderous cities in 2020 voted Trump? Is anybody talking about the fact that when we look at all 50 states, all 50 of them in 2020, we find that the rate of murder in red states was 40% higher than the rate of murder in the blue states? And I'm not here to tell you that Donald Trump is giving out guns. His party is, but I'm not here to tell you that. I'm just here to say, wait, where's this coming from? There has never been a time in US history when the claim has been that the prosecutor is causing all the crime until now, at a highly political moment. That's never happened before. And when we look at the evidence, not only is it not there, if we're going to get silly enough, and it is silly, to say that DAs cause crime, then I guess we should actually look at what I just told you, because that silly argument points the other way. That's not where it is. Let me just say this, and then we'll go to Q&A. There came a crucial moment in the history of the United States. It was 1967, 1968. That reminds me very much of this moment. I was 6 then, so I've read about it since then. Although my dad was a news junkie, so I did see some of this on the TV with Walter Cronkite. That was when we actually had reliable, responsible, unitary sort of canon of news. But anyway, 1967, there was something like 100, I guess you would say, riots. There was at least unrest around the United States. Does that remind you at all of the unrest around George Floyd? And when that happened, Richard Nixon went to the Republican convention in 1968. There's a wonderful film. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to see it, called Riotsville, USA. Riotsville, USA. Just came out this year. And when he went to that political convention, he was up there standing next to Spiro T. Agnew, another luminary of his time. And the word coming out of his mouth, ironically enough, was lawless. Lawless. Guess who was lawless? The big cities where they had diverse populations. They were lawless. Were they? Or was that just the Southern strategy? I offer this to the youngest among us. The Southern strategy was very simple. It was, we can't say the racial epithet anymore. It worked for us before, it doesn't work for us now. So we got other words. We got code words. We got dog whistles. We're going to say busing. We're going to say state rights. We're going to say lawless. That was the strategy then. What are we hearing right now out of people who want to be president of the United States? Needless to say, for those of you who remember, Spiro T. Agnew was out of office as vice president. They did very well in the 1968 election, by the way. It's not that the politics didn't work, but Spiro T. Agnew was a criminal, and he was removed from the vice presidency before Richard Nixon, who was a criminal, was, how shall I say, ushered out the door back then. Those are the people hollering lawless. Who's saying it now? Who's saying lawless now? Oh, I don't know. How about Josh Hawley? Is Josh Hawley saying lawless now? What about Tom Cotton? What about Ted Cruz? Tom Cotton, of course, who describes himself as a, quote, 7th generation agriculturalist, unquote. Arkansas, think about that one for a minute. Count back 7 generations and look into his history at Harvard of being very opposed to affirmative action. But anyway, I mean, let's not get too personal about Josh Hawley and his fist outside on January the 6th and whether or not, never mind. Anyway, we're back to that. That's where we are. We're back to that. We are back to that. We're back to the word lawless being hurled at people who say, let's do enforcement in new and scientific ways. Let's invest in prevention because that actually brings real justice. That's something that actually works. It works better than what we have seen before. And we all need to be very, very, very careful in this crucial moment, a crucial moment, not only for criminal justice, but for American democracy itself. We need to be very careful that we do not fall into the trap of somebody else's old playbook, and that we look at what the facts are and what the science shows, not only about how we do enforcement, but about what are the real causes of this spike in crime that we are seeing, particularly a spike in gun violence, and what is it we can do about it. All right. So I've had quite a few things to say, some of them intemperate. That being the case,
so he is willing to take questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Unfortunately, I know there are people participating remotely. We do not have a means of getting those questions to you, but if you're in the room and have a question, please raise your hand. Call on people. That's fine. I can't if you prefer.
I mean, I'm happy to have you call on them, but I just want to say, please don't raise your hand unless the question is provocative, verging on rude.
right? I think we can meet that bar. Here we go.
I'll do my best. My name is Kurshi. 8.5 years. I have friends who have died of fish. I've been saved courtesy of the good people at the hospital you can. And with that, as someone who vocally has a more advanced understanding than some of your peers maybe as far as the matrix of reasons that people end up committing crimes against property and things like these. Sorry. How does that translate into your prosecutorial discretion, like on a daily basis? You know, when and how to charge?
Thank you for that. Congratulations on your recovery. You hang in there. Pretty important. How does it translate? Well, in many different ways. I mean, first of all, it is our goal with any arrest for possession to direct people towards the opportunity for treatment. As I'm sure you know, people who do recover often have many different encounters with treatment before it sticks. And it does appear that forced treatment is not successful, not nearly as successful in most instances than the ready availability of voluntary treatment and having contact with it at moments of crisis. For example, at the moment of being arrested, to have the opportunity to engage in that voluntary treatment. So we're really not looking to convict people for possession of drugs. That doesn't do any good. We're looking, if they are arrested, to put them in connection with treatment and to do everything that we can to push it along in that direction. You know, we can talk about marijuana, but you and I both know it doesn't kill anybody. That's a lot safer than spotted cow. We all know that. I mean, I wouldn't know, but I'm sure it doesn't taste as good. But it's a lot safer.
That's spotted cow because you're not discussed.
Well, you know what? I'm looking forward to some spotted cow in the future.
Figure that out.
But I will say this, you know, many years ago in my younger days, when I was doing a lot of representation of protest groups, and that included ACT UP, for example, which I did pro bono, they started to do needle exchange. This is the 1980s. They started doing it. It was very controversial. Needless to say, like all change, it made people uncomfortable. Police were opposed to it. And we had a mayor who passed an executive order that said, police stop messing with people who are getting the clean needles, you know? And we all know that what that means is that our children were at much lower risk of contracting HIV when, you know, they started having sexual activity. It wasn't just about people who were using needles. It was about all of us to stop the spread of that addiction. So, you know, I am a firm believer in harm reduction of many different ways because it has made us all safer. It's where we got to go. And I'm also a firm believer that for people who are trying to deal with their addiction, it doesn't do a whole lot of good to pile convictions on them and make it harder for them to become employed and harder for them to recover. You know, but perhaps more than anything, I'm a firm believer that you have to survive to recover. And we have to do everything we can in government to allow people to survive. And that includes things as controversial as what has been done very, very successfully in other countries for a very long time, such as having a place where if they're going to use their drugs anyway, which they are, they can be observed and they can be revived when an overdose starts to stop their breathing. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Are there other questions?
Sure. I'm going to touch on the harm reduction piece. The governor of California just vetoed a bill that would have implemented harm reduction in California. What are your thoughts about that?
This is my thought. For those of you who may find yourselves even this evening in a location where they are serving alcohol, I want you to think about this. We have a harm reduction system in the United States. It's called our bar. What happens in our bars and what happens in our liquor stores is that you go to buy something that is actually the most toxic drug in the United States by far, cuts off far more years of lives than any other. It's right up there with tobacco. And what do we do with it? We license it. We record its potency. We make sure that potency is legitimate. Even if you're inside of a bar, they are literally profiting off of dealing you that drug. They have guidelines, and if they see you fall off of your chair, you seem to be having a medical emergency, they're going to call for medical care. They're going to try to help you with that. We have a harm reduction system. We've had it since the end of Prohibition. It is beyond me why we should not have a harm reduction system that is not for profit when we have a harm reduction system that is for profit in the United States. I know that's frankly a little glib and we should have a longer discussion about it. But, I mean, how are you going to recover if you don't survive? Why would we have a situation where our system compels people who are suffering from addiction to inject alone behind a dumpster and die behind that dumpster, when we could have a system where we're at least going to try to stop them from dying so they can get up the next day and seek recovery? It makes no sense to me that we would do anything other than try to help those people.
You started talking about things with other countries. I'm sure you're aware, because I know your office has moved away from cash bail. I'm a private practice criminal defense attorney. That we in the Philippines are two of the only countries in the Western world that still regularly play the use of cash. What have been arguments that you found to be most effective in moving people who are married to the cash bail system off of that and thinking about it in a different way?
Thank you for that question. First of all, most people don't understand what it means to say no cash bail. That's really where our problem starts. The no cash bail does not mean everybody goes home. It means far from it. No cash bail means let us divorce money from the process of who gets held and who doesn't. This is a system that has existed in DC now for over 30 years. It is now in New Jersey, it's in Kentucky, it's in Illinois. I understand it's going to be here next year, and it's really similar to what goes on in the federal system. I can tell you the experience in DC works out as follows. About 12% of all defendants are held, and they are held until trial, and it doesn't matter how rich they are or how powerful they are, they're held. Weinstein's going to get held. Pablo Escobar and Chapo are going to get held. Doesn't matter how much money they have, they ain't going home. Now, call me crazy. That sounds kind of law and order-y to me. Now, at the other end, you have 88% who are not made to pay these small bails, $10,000, which is actually $1,000 in many jurisdictions, or $500 or whatever it is. And the reason that they aren't is when they're unemployed, they can't pay anything at all. And when they're employed, they can pay it. So what exactly are we doing? We're taking people who are accused of nonviolent offenses, who we don't think are a genuine danger to the community, but we're going to charge them a bail they can't pay, and then the taxpayer is going to pay $135 a night to keep them in jail. Doesn't make sense. What we need to have is a system where you are either held or you are released, and how prosperous you are and how employed you are has absolutely nothing to do with this. This should not be a cage for broke people on non-serious offenses, and it should not be a place where rich criminals can get out whenever they want. That's what no cash bail is about. But it is hard to talk about because people hear no cash bail and they think that it means everybody goes home. It most definitely does not mean that. I bet you can come up with a better way to describe it than I just did. But I think the notion of talking about how you divorce the process from money, I think that maybe is a start.
Much for being here. Learned so much. My name is Stephanie. I'm a 2L here. You talked about a lot of stopping criminalization of drug addiction, mental health issues. The idea for me of this like abolition, right? And so I think that there's a big that term means. But again, from my understanding it is investment in communities. It is, prevention and investment in healthcare and things like that. So I'm curious to hear what you think about using that kind of term or, practicing through an abolitionist lens. Do you feel like it's ostracizing? And so it's just.
Well, I think that this is what I think. I think that in the same way that the phrase defund the police was used by people who were opposed to reform to mislead some people, I think there is the potential for the word abolition to be used by people who are opposed to reform to mislead some people. I would never propose to tell you what words should be used to support that. But I will, obviously we should invest in community. You look at the cities that have seen very long-term sustained reductions in gun violence over many years. Those are the same cities where there were tens of millions of dollars going into community-based organizations that are not connected to law enforcement. Those are the same cities. You see declining violence, you see declining incarceration in those cities. So it seems to me rather obvious that when we invest in people's basic needs, which is not something that the United States is particularly good at, but when we invest in their basic needs, we see that there is a reduction in crime and also a reduction in incarceration. But let me also say this. If abolition in the minds of some people means the complete elimination of police and the complete elimination of prisons, let's look at Germany. They didn't do it completely, but they've got 1/9 the number of inmates. So is that kind of sort of like I guess, what is it, 88%? Is that kind of sort of a long way towards abolition? I mean, do we have to be so binary? Is it actually the complete elimination of these facilities? So we have nowhere to put Ted Bundy and Charles Manson? Is it actually that? Or is it enough to say there aren't that many people who need to be in jail, but there are some? Aren't we going almost all the way towards this vision of abolition by reducing the footprint and simultaneously increasing public safety while we reduce incarceration?
1/9 per capita or 1/9?
It is modern Germany. My understanding is per capita. These are rates. So it is per capita.
So we're at about an hour now, but I'd love to be able to take at least a couple more questions if that's okay with you. Please.
So, DA Krasner, first off, thank you for coming. So I have a question with regards to the actions of prosecutors, specifically when it comes down to interactions with the community. One of the things I noticed while summaring at a prosecutor's office last semester, or last summer, there was a practice where prosecutors didn't want to interact with anyone dealing with. So your office, what are some of the programs and policies that you heard of the prosecutors actually basis and more or less build relationships that we can try to circumvent some of the issues?
Great question. Any prosecutor's office that doesn't want to deal with the community is out of his mind and has got something coming to it, which they're about to get. That doesn't make any sense. I realize that your experience is what happened, but that's nuts. So first of all, you need to have a community engagement unit that is regularly engaging with the communities that are most affected by activity in the criminal justice system. What that means is you have to actively get to know community-based organizations, activists, other influencers, other leaders in that community, and you have to be accessible to it. I spent going and speaking in different communities about their concerns. Some of them are extremely friendly, but then yell at me. That's great. That's how this is supposed to work. I'm supposed to be accountable to them. I'm supposed to hear them. And frankly, I learn a lot from doing that. It's certainly the right way to go about it. And there is a level of being connected, a level of connectedness to the community that I think it's things like this. Strangely enough, in our re-election, despite a real vigorous effort, we wanted a landslide. But the landslide was nowhere bigger than in the areas most affected by gun violence in the midst of a unique crisis in gun violence. These are areas where, let's not get too gory about it, but I've been to crime scenes in these areas. The extent of trauma that is served on a neighborhood by a shooting goes way beyond those families. It goes to the fabric of that society. And yet what we see, and this is partly because we are connected, what we see is that those are the communities that are most vigorously in favor of the things that they see as a change. They've been suffering chronic violence in many instances for decades, but they know that the change is not to go back to what we did in 1954. They know that the only way to solve this is to try some tactics. None of that is possible unless they know what you're doing. None of that is possible unless you listen to what their concerns are and how you can be supportive. But I think that is that crucial.
Similar to Ed's question, but you made a comment about how the system is fundamentally broken or operating exactly how it's meant to be. And you know, any significant change that we see is always led by like a social movement and by the people that are deeply affected. So what is your accountability for grassroots movements in Philadelphia specifically, and the history of like political prisoners being like railroaded by the Philadelphia police and like your commitment to that?
Great question. So I guess I had the advantage that I spent on more than 20 years representing a lot of this and doing it for free. So I had some relationships that went back a long way, and they were extremely helpful in getting an outsider candidate, and I was a total outsider candidate. Even when I ran for re-election, the mainstream Democratic Party and the mayor would not endorse me, which is unheard of when you're an incumbent, but they wouldn't do that. So there has been support coming a lot of in a way, but we also have to understand, and Kim Fox in Chicago talks about this at length. She got there with a lot of community support initially. I think it's important to understand that sometimes I tick them off. Sometimes what I do, they don't like at all. And I think that flows from this. The truth is that one of the wonderful things about activists is they speak with this prophetic voice. They're able to talk in ways that are broad and bright brushstrokes. It's a little bit like campaigning, really. You talk in these grand terms so that people can understand the change you're trying to bring. That sometimes collides with governing. That sometimes collides with the reality that there's going to be 135 people arrested on any given day in Philadelphia. And we have to deal with those issues right now. And sometimes those issues are a little more complicated. As much as I have been a huge advocate for reducing mass incarceration down to the people who need to be there, and FYI, in the first 2 years, we reduced by half the number of years of future incarceration that the Philly courts were pushing out. As much as I have been a fan of reducing mass supervision in, I mean, I could go on and on, but Pennsylvania has a nutty level of this stuff. Philadelphia, when I came into office, had a level of supervision on probation and parole that was 25 times higher than the city of New York, 25 times higher, right? And we have cut that down by 2/3. As much as I am in favor of trying to get juveniles out of these snake pit placements that cost a fortune where they only fail, and we reduced those placements by 80% in the first 2 years, it is not the case that I can always say that every single juvenile, including the guy who was 17 and a half when he shot and killed 4 people, has to stay in a juvenile system that ends at 21. It just isn't. So I am going to do things because one size does not fit all. I'm going to do things because mandatory sentences don't make sense, and neither do mandatory policies when you're trying to do individual justice. I'm going to do things that do not match up to the prophetic voice, that are not as simple as an absolute. And that is a discussion that, you know, as Kim Fox used to say, said to me actually, before I was in there, the advocates, the activists, the community had a list of 10 demands. I gave them 8. And then I'd let them come in to talk to me. And their answer was, what about the other 2? That's what she said. Now, you may think I'm trying to make light of activists. I'm not. I truly fundamentally admire. That's why I spend so much time for them for free. But there are going to be times when there's a difference between the prophetic voice and the reality of what you have to do in governing. And there are going to be instances when what they want and what we want doesn't match up. And that's just, you know, that's just where it is. So I hope that we can all evolve together to a place where there is understanding that when you get a hell of a lot of what you want, but not everything, then maybe we're going in the right direction.
I know there are more questions here, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So please join me once again in thanking Larry Krasner. I have just a couple more things before we part. One is that we've got a number of distinguished guests in the room. Distinguished members of our faculty, distinguished alumni, distinguished students. All of our students are very distinguished, and I hope you'll hire some of them. But there are 4 people in particular, at the risk of offending others who I see you and we're very glad you're here, but 4 people in particular, I just want to single out. First of all, we have 3 members of our state Supreme Court here with us this evening, and we're very grateful to all 3 of you, Justice Bradley, Justice Karofsky, Justice Dallett, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening. Thank you. I do want to thank very much the Kastenmeier Committee, and to recognize a member of that committee who was a part of our law faculty here for 30 years. I only had the privilege of overlapping with her for 1 year prior to her becoming dean of another law school, Michigan State University. And this, of course, is Dean Linda Green. Linda, we never really got to say a proper goodbye to you because of the pandemic. And honestly, we hope we never have to, because we will always consider you a part of our community. But please join me in thanking Dean Green. Okay, here's the last thing. This is our tradition here. What is this lovely creature? This is the gargoyle, the symbol of this law school. The gargoyle, there were actually 2 of them originally on the old building before, this beautiful building before it was torn down decades ago. One of them sits out in the lobby of this building. The other one was thought to be lost, and for many years it was, but it turned out had been carted away. So the story was that it was like struck by lightning and found on the ground. Yeah, right. Anyways, by one of our graduates who is now long since passed, but it apparently was actually not lost. It was in some backyard. Well, it went to Virginia for a while, made it back. And anyways, the other gargoyle now sits in my office. The gargoyle is a symbol of the indomitable character of UW Law and everyone associated with it. And we presented at these kinds of lectures as a way of welcoming you to our community, thanking you for being here, and a symbol that you are always part of our community. And I like to think of the gargoyle as a symbol of our commitment to making those words inscribed on the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, which we put right in our mission statement, a reality, something that this year's Kastenmeier Lecturer's remarks really embodied. So thank you so much for being our lecturer. Definitely. All right. Wonderful to you all for joining us. And let's hope that we are able to do many, many more of these in the future. Thank you all for being here this evening.